Hi, this is Gautam, and today we are going to look at this historical fiction novel, Raiders from the North. This book is the first in a series of Empire of the Mogul. There are totally six books, and this is the first one written by Alex Rutherford. And Alex Rutherford is the pen name of two authors, Diana and Michael Preston. And, before we proceed with the actual review of the book, just one note on historical fiction and what makes historical fiction slightly challenging. You know, when you write a story based on historical characters, there is this blend of both reality and fiction. You know that the characters which you have are real. You also know that the events which are going to happen in the story are real to an extent. For example, when does a character, if you take the lead character, at least the lead character and the characters which are surrounding the lead character. For example, this novel, if you take, it's about the life of Babur. Babur, to an extent, it is going to be real. At the same time, the time period, or when does a fort get captured, when does he leave a city, all those things are real to an extent. Now, the point is, how do you make sure that you add an element of fiction because you have a certain level of liberty as an author, but at the same time you retain that historical context? That is the biggest challenge when you go for historical fiction. And the challenge is to make sure that you bring all those characters live, and in this book, the authors succeed quite brilliantly because all those elements which are part of the time period of late 15th century and early 16th century is properly captured. When you talk about the time it is happening, it's around 1490s to 1526, 1530. So you're talking about a time period in which you had this large amount of conquest which was going on in Central Asia. And the hero of the story, of course, a historical character, Babur, on all the events which start pretty much takes place in today's area of Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan. So when the authors try to narrate the story, they try to add so much of flavor beyond the level of history what we know. Now we do know that Babur was actually trying to capture Samarkand. He did capture the city of Samarkand, and he had to leave the city due to multiple reasons, and then he had to move to Kabul, and from Kabul he tries to invade India, and then he comes and sets a seat in Delhi in his final years. Now, through the story, they try to explore multiple historical contexts which were going on in that time period. For example, the three main components, if you look at it, the first is the tribal conflicts. You had this huge amount of, what do you call, horse raiders who come from different tribal areas, and within tribals there were so many divisions. For example, there is this traditional conflict or traditional dichotomy between Uzbeks and the descendants of Taimur. Babur is a descendant of Taimur, and what is this conflict with the Uzbeks? At the same time, how marriages, well, even today, are mostly political, and they are, their marriages have a lot more strategic purposes than we think. So you have 4 to 5 tribals to make sure that you have moderate or at least some amount of good diplomacy between different groups. You make sure that you have marriage exchanges happening. That is properly explored in this novel. And the second being the Shia and Sunni divide in Islam. So within Islam, how does the religious sect becomes a major conflict, and it's much more bigger than tribals are even ready to tolerate that they are between two different groups. But when it comes to Shia and Sunni sect of Islam, which is a burning issue in today's world, you take the Cold War between Saudi Arabia and Iran, you find that the conflict has always been there historically, and that is one more dimension which is properly addressed in this book as a key element, also as a key turning point in events also. And the part which I like the most is, to properly convey to the reader what are the actual problems a militant, or problems in, what do you call, the military would face when they are fighting against climate, physiography, and weather. The harsh temperature conditions, the immense amount of cold which you find in Central Asia during your winter seasons. So it kind of restricts when you can attack into a fort and when you cannot. You'll have to determine based on that. And you need to make sure that your horses get proper food. How does all your supplies move along with the army? All those elements are written properly, and it kind of shows the amount of dominance which nature had over man, which is very much true until the last 100 or 120 years, except for this COVID-19 pandemic. So back then it was nature which pretty much determines most of the things which happen. You have a river, for example, Indus was a mighty river even today. So how difficult is it for an army to cross over Indus river? And if you have winter for close to 2 to 3 months, it is simply impossible to move your forces, which means you'll have to wait it out. So, how does the siege of a particular city work, and what are the difficulties which people have within the city and the raiders who stay outside the city? And to close it out, I like the way the book was closed. After the novel is ended, the authors give a small historical note. Babur wrote his the first autobiography in the literature, and that is Babur Nama. And the authors say that most of the content which they derived is directly from the autobiography, and they also go on to point out that there are certain elements or there are certain characters which are properly real, starting from the mother, starting from the sister, and so on and so forth. And they also say, these are characters which we simply added fictionally just to make sure the story looks really well. So, the authors actually try to appreciate, or they've tried to give in the reader, this is properly history and these are things properly fiction. And you finally have a list which says this is the set of historical events also. So this is the first in a series of 6 books, and this is the first one I've read. I'm definitely looking forward to reading the other 5 also, and I definitely recommend. This is a captivating and a persevering story, really written well. Thank you.